Hello and welcome back to the Story Shed. That's right, it's the shed where the stories live, I think, around here somewhere. So I'm going to capture a story for you and read it. And today's story is by Hans Christian Andersen, and it's a retelling from the original story. So it's a bit shorter than the original. And it's Thumbelina. And Thumbelina is quite a classic fairy tale. So let me begin. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Once upon a time, there was a woman who wanted more than anything in the world to have a child. But she didn't know where to get one. She went to see a witch about it, and the witch gave her a special seed. The woman planted the seed in a flower pot, and it grew into a bud that looked very much like the bud of a tulip. "What a beautiful flower," the woman murmured one day, and she leant over and kissed the closed petals. Pop! The bud exploded into an open flower, and sitting in the middle of it was a tiny little girl, no bigger than the woman's thumb. The woman was overjoyed with her beautiful daughter and named her Thumbelina. The woman thought that her tiny daughter was utterly delightful and looked after her tenderly. But one night, a big, fat toad came hopping through a broken pane of glass in the woman's window. Mmm, thought the toad, as her bulging eyes caught sight of Thumbelina sleeping in half walnut shell. She would make a perfect wife for my son. The toad picked up the dreaming little girl and hopped away to the marshy river where she lived. The toad placed Thumbelina on a broad, flat lily pad. Now you can't run away, the toad thought, and she swam off to break the good news to her son. When Thumbelina woke up and saw that she was not only lost, but trapped too, she began to cry bitterly. The fish wiggled up to see what was causing all the tiny splashes and ripples, and they took pity on the sad, tiny girl. Quickly and silently they nibbled through the lily pad's green stem, and Thumbelina went floating down the river. Soon she was far out of the toad's reach, and still the lily pad raft floated on. Thumbelina sailed past towns and was swept out into the countryside. Now, Thumbelina liked it amongst the fields. It was sunny and peaceful, and a pretty white butterfly fluttered down to keep her company. Suddenly, a large flying beetle dive-bombed a lily pad and wrapped his legs around Thumbelina's tiny waist. In a flash, Thumbelina found herself sitting on a twig with a beetle high up in a tree, watching her lily pad drift away without her. Hundreds of the beetle's curious friends came crawling out of the bark to peer at what he'd brought home. "Ugh! Look, it's only got 2 legs," the beetle children squealed. "Where are its feelers?" some of the lady beetles murmured. "Hasn't it got a slim bottom?" Other lady beetles gasped in horror, admiring their own round, shiny ones. "It's ugly," the male beetles had to admit. "Let's get rid of it." And they flew down from the tree with Thumbelina and sat her on a daisy. Poor Thumbelina felt very like crying, but just then she noticed a little hole in the earth below her that looked very like it was a type of doorway. She jumped down from the daisy and peered into the gloom. "Hello!" she cried. "Is anyone at home?" After a few seconds, out popped a field mouse's head. She looked Thumbelina up and down and tutted loudly. "Dear, dear," the field mouse scolded. "You look exhausted and hungry. If you're as lost as you look, you're very welcome to stay here with me in return for keeping my rooms nice and clean and tidy." So all winter, Thumbelina lived with the field mouse. Every day she washed and swept and scoured and polished, and the field mouse was very kind to her, though Thumbelina found life rather boring. The field mouse wasn't at all skilled at making conversation, and neither was her regular visitor, Mr. Mole. He came once every week in his fine black velvet overcoat, but he didn't like to talk. He just enjoyed sitting and peering at Thumbelina through his little eyes, listening to her sing. The field mouse was delighted that her friend so liked Thumbelina. I think he's falling in love with you, she whispered to Thumbelina excitedly. The field mouse was even more sure that she was right when Mr. Mole invited them both to visit him in his splendid underground mansion. I've dug a tunnel from your house to mine, Mr. Mole informed them, so you may come and see me in comfort. Only please close your eyes when you're halfway down the passage, for I'm afraid that a dead swallow is lying there. Thumbelina wasn't at all revolted when she came across the dead bird on her first trip to Mr. Mole's house. Instead, she felt pity for the poor thing lying all stiff and still on the cold earth. While the field mouse ran on eagerly ahead, Thumbelina bent down and stroked the bird's feathers. Goodbye, sweet swallow, she murmured, and she laid her head on the bird's soft breast. Dop, dop, dop. Thumbelina heard the swallow's heart beating, only very faintly, but Thumbelina knew that the bird was still just alive. From then on, Thumbelina found as many excuses as possible to creep away from the field mouse and into the tunnel to care for the swallow. Gradually, the swallow began to recover, and by the time the weather had begun to grow warmer, the swallow was well enough to stand and hop about. On the first day of spring, the swallow was totally better. One day I'll repay you, he twittered as he hopped up the passageway and soared off into the sky. It was then that the field mouse announced to Thumbelina that she had arranged for her to be married to Mr. Mole. He's very wealthy and will take good care of you, the field mouse beamed. But Thumbelina was horrified. I can't live my life underground, she cried, and ran sobbing out into the fields. Just then, Thumbelina heard a familiar twittering above her head. She looked up and saw her friend the swallow swooping down towards her. Come away with me, cried the swallow. I know a place where you'll be happy. Joyfully, Thumbelina jumped onto his back. The swallow flew off with Thumbelina to a land where the weather was always sunny and where in every flower there lived a tiny person, just like Thumbelina. Thumbelina was very happy in her new home. She even married a handsome prince who lived in a rosebud and who was extremely glad that she had never become Mrs. Mole. And that's the end of the story of Thumbelina by Hans Christian Andersen. And we'll probably have more stories by him later on in the Story Shed. If there are any stories that you'd like to hear or anything that you've written yourself, then you can write to us at the storyshedblog@gmail.com. That's the storyshedblog@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Take care of yourselves, be safe, and for the time being, bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.